Good afternoon, everybody. As you can see, we now worked out where everybody's going to sit, so I think I'll close the session while we're ahead. Good afternoon. We've arrived at the closing ceremony of the third edition of the World Reconstruction Conference, embedded today in the midst of the European Development Days. My name is Nigel Fisher, and I'm your moderator for the closing session. It's really been a packed couple of days, and we're also packing as much as we can into this closing ceremony. And in the course of the session, we're going to watch a short video that hopefully captures the essence of the last few days' discussion and of the participants' perspectives as well. And later, Barbara Pesce-Montero will share with us the key messages to be issued in the joint conference communiqué. Now, I'm sure you'll agree with me that we're very fortunate and that we have two keynote addresses to start the session. And it's a fine example of cohesive cross-Atlantic resilience. First, the European Union Commissioner for International Cooperation and Development, Neven Mimica, will open the session, and Commissioner Mimica will have to depart as soon as he has finished his address. So don't think he's running away. Then he will be followed by the keynote speech of Wade Warren, Acting Administration of USAID. Then immediately after the two keynotes, we'll watch the conference video and then move on to the panel discussion. So we've assembled a group of very distinguished panelists today, and some of whom you've seen in action over the last couple of days, and some of them not once but several times. So let me briefly introduce them to you, and some of them to you again. We have, first of all, the Honorable Zainab Ahmed, Minister of State of the Ministry of Budget and National Planning of Nigeria. Robert Glasser, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and Head of UNISDR, and perhaps known to many of you from his previous incarnation as the Secretary General of CARE International. Vivanu Gnasunu, Assistant Secretary General of the African, Caribbean and Pacific Group of States, welcome. Sameh Wahba, Director of Urban and Territorial Development, Disaster Risk Management and Resilience of the World Bank. Barbara Pesce-Montero, Director of the United Nations and UNDP Office in Brussels. And it's a special pleasure to welcome Suman Kumar, an EDD young leader and representative from Nepal. And Acting Administrator Warren will also join the panel after speaking. Now, following the panel discussion, it might be more of panel presentations than discussion, Barbara will present to us the conference communiqué and its key messages. And finally, Sameh Wahba will complete the session and the conference with a vote of thanks. So that's how the session is organized today. And the theme of this session, as you will have seen, is leveraging political consensus on promoting resilience through post-crisis recovery. In the course of the conference, we've examined resilient recovery from all angles in relation to disasters, armed conflict, combinations of both, and in context of fragility. We've looked at our increasingly complex risk environment as the impacts of climate change, urbanization, migration, and other factors accelerate and interact. The Sendai Framework, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the Sustainable Development Goals have formed our backdrop. We've examined both the drivers and impediments to resilient recovery and risk-informed development. We've looked at strengthening institutions and financial frameworks, social services, social protection, livelihoods and entrepreneurship. We've looked at social inclusion, women's leadership, devolution of decision-making below the national level. The challenge, of course, is to ensure implementation of these important priorities, which requires, above all, the political will to actually do so, as well as the policy changes, the appropriate institutional and financial frameworks, dedicated resources and efforts. So the emphasis of this closing session is on the exercise of that political will, as our speakers and panelists discuss how to institutionalize resilient recovery and highlight ways in which governments, development partners, and the many stakeholders from all walks of life can assure and leverage the political consensus required to promote resilience through post-crisis recovery. So without further ado, it is now my pleasure to ask Commissioner Mimica to take the floor for his keynote speech. Commissioner.
Very good afternoon, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased to be with you today at the closing ceremony and the panel discussion of the third edition of the World Reconstruction Conference. Let me start by thanking our distinguished panelists, the African, Caribbean and Pacific countries, the World Bank and Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, the United Nations Development Programme, and my own colleagues at the European Commission for bringing this important event together with the European Development Days. I also warmly welcome the 800 experts and practitioners from all over the world who attended this conference. I'm confident that over the last 2 days, you have had some very fruitful exchanges about recovery and reconstruction. I'm grateful for the incredible work you do to promote resilience and reduce the risks and impacts of crisis. From the Commission's perspective, this is a perfect opportunity to discuss how we can make recovery more resilient. We have just finalized our proposals on how to develop and implement, together with our member states and international partners, a strategic approach to resilience in our external action. Building on our own experiences and lessons learned, we are now expanding the scope of the European Union's approach to resilience by putting emphasis on an enhanced state and societal resilience to cope with different types of risks and pressures. Strengthening resilience is intended to make European Union external action more coherent, more responsive, and more flexible, and therefore more efficient. We want to break the silos and ensure that EU political, diplomatic, development, and humanitarian actors work more closely together when assessing and implementing resilience measures in partner countries. We want to ensure that our political and operational responses to impending crises are more timely and integrated by better monitoring and analyzing external pressures. And we want to work more closely with our partner countries and local actors to increase their own resilience and ultimately their ability to protect the most vulnerable. For example, we are looking specifically at strengthening resilience in rapidly growing urban areas where a lack of planning or investment in climate change mitigation and other geophysical risks can expose people to huge risks when significant damage occurs. Addressing the underlying risk factors upfront through a more informed public and better designed private and public investments is proving more cost-effective than post-disaster responses. Finally, we are also looking to increase our policy and practical cooperation with international partners on research and, where possible, on share data, alerts, and align our approaches. We hope this will result in more efficient actions on the ground. Because the impacts of future disasters are likely to be even more devastating given the additional complications of climate change, urbanism, food price fluctuations, financial shocks, and other stresses. When it comes to natural disasters, we cannot prevent droughts in Ethiopia or earthquakes in Nepal or Italy, but we can work more effectively together to help states and communities to adapt, minimize, and eventually to recover from these types of disasters. We have to accept that risk is a very real possibility in many of the contexts in which we work. This should be factored in upfront, rather than being seen as an unexpected exception after the event. Some good examples of this are the Global Network Against Food Crisis and the discussion you had on resilient cities. When it comes to conflicts, we need a different approach. This should include early action in response to early warning, closer coordination to support regional and country-led plans, new policy and program guidance, and better collaboration between humanitarian and development actors, not only in managing the crisis, but to build resilience from the onset. Last but not least, we must ensure better coordination between the European Union, World Bank, United Nations, and other major players, based on shared analysis, such as the reconstruction and the peace-building assessments, or the post-natural disasters assessments. The example of Nepal is a good case in point, because ultimately, our resilience efforts are about protecting the most vulnerable people in the most vulnerable of circumstances. We owe it to all of them to do whatever we can to build more effective approaches and responses which improve lives and livelihoods and avoid human sufferance. Thank you very much indeed, and I look forward to the panel to contribute to the overall success of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you. So you'll slip away, won't you? Okay. Thank you, Commissioner. Better coordination on shared analysis. Yes, we all believe in that. Better informed early investment. But I think what I take particularly from your speech is your emphasis on improved partnership with local actors. And I think above all, we're seeing a sea change as external partners start to accompany more local actors and perhaps do a little less more directly ourselves. So I think that emphasis on accompanying and helping local actors is very critical. So now may I ask Acting USAID Administrator Wade Warren to come to the podium for his keynote address. Thank you. Cheers.
Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, I'm honored to be here today with this distinguished group of policymakers and thought leaders to talk about promoting resilience, which is a topic that we at USAID have come to believe is critical to the future of our development efforts. Like Commissioner Mimica, I want to thank the organizers of this session for hosting us this afternoon, the African, Caribbean, and Pacific Group of States Secretariat, the European Union, the United Nations Development Program, and the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. As an organization and as a global community, we have been responding to humanitarian disasters for more than 50 years. This work intensified in the 1980s as we saw the horror and tragic human cost of the famine in Ethiopia, where more than 1 million people lost their lives. And for the last 30 years, we've seen droughts come and go, and with it, our humanitarian responses expand and contract. Each of these crises has erased gains that our development efforts have made and brought us back to square one, putting millions of lives at risk. Today, we're at a new height of food insecurity with nearly unprecedented levels of need. As we work to respond to this immediate crisis, we need to also focus on how we can break this cycle and create lasting change. And that's not easy. If it were easy, we would have done it a long time ago. Too often, after a drought, disaster, or other hardship subsides, and people pick themselves up and get back to where they stood before the crisis, too often they are hit again and dragged back down into extreme poverty, hunger, and desperation. This all too common cycle undermines any real hope of significant gains or sustained progress. If we want to be successful development organizations, we need to change this narrative. At USAID, we believe that breaking this cycle begins by promoting country-owned efforts to strengthen resilience and manage risks. At USAID, we define resilience as the ability of people, households, communities, countries, and systems to mitigate, adapt to, and recover from shocks and stresses in a manner that reduces chronic vulnerability and facilitates inclusive growth. Now, that's a mouthful. Put more simply, it's the ability to bounce back, to make it through tough times without sacrificing the future. We began focusing on building resilience after the 2011 and 2012 drought in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. We've helped people diversify their incomes and tap into more reliable markets, established insurance programs that pay out as droughts occur, helped governments develop shock-responsive safety nets, and supported improved health, nutrition, and expanded access to education. These efforts take a holistic approach to meeting the specific needs of the world's most vulnerable populations. They expand economic opportunities, manage natural resources responsibly, boost risk management capabilities, and improve people's ability to earn a living. And most importantly, they're working. In northern Kenya, significant reductions in poverty and hunger and improvements in dietary diversity and access to water have all been achieved in just a few years. In the dry lands of Ethiopia, households and communities reached by comprehensive resilience programs were able to maintain their food security during the severe 2016 El Niño drought, while households in other communities experienced a precipitous 30% decline in food security. That's real progress and proof that this approach works. That also means that those communities are able to use their resources to better their lives rather than to dig out of a hole. People there have a chance. Take the case of Daki Wako Benetta. Daki is a herder in rural Ethiopia who sells milk for a living. In the past, she had to get up early every morning, milk her cows, walk to the end of a long road, and hope to sell her milk on the corner. If she didn't sell the milk, she had to throw it away and start over the next morning. In times of drought, when sales were slow, she would have to sell off a cow, losing her limited source of funds and creating a real hole for her to climb out of when things picked up. But our resilience efforts helped connect her to a distributor that uses her milk to produce yogurt. With a steady source of income, she was able to weather the tough times and use her profit to invest in and grow her business. Daki's story is not unique. This approach works. But ultimately, these efforts to come to scale have a long-term impact and begin to break the cycle of recurrent crisis. For these things to happen, the programs have to be country-owned and country-led. Kenya and Ethiopia have been real leaders on this front. In Kenya, the government committed $1.6 billion to its Ending Drought Emergencies initiative, alongside $1.5 billion from other donors, including the United States. The government also helped scale up an insurance program that USAID successfully piloted, which is now paying out $2 million to 12,000 vulnerable households impacted by drought. In Ethiopia, the government partnered with USAID to increase the incomes of 33,000 households by $370, which enabled those households to graduate from a social protection program that currently supports 8 million people. These governments are also leading the response to the current and recent droughts in their countries. In Kenya and Ethiopia, large-scale social safety net programs have been designed to expand and provide cash or food to millions of additional people when drought occurs. These and other efforts have enabled the governments to respond far earlier, at scale, and at a third of the cost of donor-financed humanitarian responses. Progress is being made, but as you all know, massive challenges still exist, and we need the entire international community engaged to help manage them. I would suggest that in addition to meeting the acute humanitarian need, focusing on resilience is a good bet. A DFID study found that every $1 invested in resilience will result in $2.90 of reduced humanitarian spending, avoided losses, and improved development outcomes. In an environment where we are all strained by growing global needs, that's a good return on investment. Last year, the United States Congress passed a law, the Global Food Security Act of 2016, that put building resilience front and center as a means of achieving the goals of a food-secure world. So we in the United States are committed to pursuing a resilience agenda. I hope you will join us in this effort and work with us, and importantly, with local governments, to put an end to these recurrent crises. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Warren. I think your emphasis on social protection and social safety nets is very important. There's been some discussion over the last couple of days of how too many programs are structurally designed so that they actually limit the access of the poorest and the most vulnerable to the opportunity to become more resilient. So very welcome. So before we go to the panel, I think it's time to look at the conference video.
Welcome to the third World Reconstruction Conference.
I think it's important that we bring recovery practitioners, in particular governments, together to look at what have we learned, where are we at, and really sharing experiences to do it better in the future. Because recovery process is simply an extremely important opportunity to address sustainable development issues, reduce vulnerabilities, reduce risk, an opportunity we cannot lose.
I think the international community, especially the United Nations, European Commission, also the World Bank, are really stepping up their efforts in terms of providing support for reconstructions, recovery, not only for natural disasters, but also for man-made disasters. Focus on institutions is key. Focusing on the root cause of fragility and conflicts, and making sure that you embed prevention in reconstruction.
Very recently, we have the Ebola epidemic, which dealt a very serious blow to my country. And we've been also having incidents of flooding. There is a very strong link between the two, because at the end of the day, you have to prevent it, you mitigate it, or you respond to it.
The biggest obstacle for us tend to be resources, but not just resources, but mobilizing resources. When you're working with partners, they tend to actually have their own contingent that comes with the system. We need that flexibility with it, and they need to understand the context and the local environment they're actually going to be helping with.
We talk a lot about how can you get enough money to respond quickly to a disaster, and that's very important. Without having money, you cannot respond. But the one thing I would say is equally important to think in advance of how that money gets spent. How can you make sure that the money reaches the right beneficiaries at the right time?
It's helping us in Nigeria to understand more how we can take advantage of the opportunities of that multilateral institutions are offering, how we can take advantage of the nexus that the UN system is trying to create now of development and humanitarian support. And also we're listening to country examples, countries that have similar situations to us.
The fact of life is, with or without international presence, it's always local people who respond first. Neighbor to neighbor, local organizations, etc. So it's really, how can we make sure they have the skills, the capacities, the resources they need?
The mix of expert in the sense of those who write about and those who analyze the issues, but also those who are in the field, those who are in the rubble and picking up the stones. So that this good mixture that we see already here today, I mean, this really has to continue like that.
If we can become realists in what we're looking at and how we really want to focus on building back better and stronger and making sure our communities are more resilient, I think overall our expectations will be met much better.
So how do we go about building the capacity of countries to have the right institutions in place, the financing mechanisms, and the policies that will accelerate recovery and help to both save lives and reduce costs?
Well, thank you for your applause. I think the team that put that together in record fashion really deserved that applause. It was really good. And there will be a short autograph signing ceremony after the closure for those of you who want it. Okay, let's move on to the panel discussion. And I'm just going to ask the panelists one question each. As always, we're a little pressed for time, so it's really going to allow us one question per panelist before we move on to the closing and the communique. So, Minister Ahmed, I'm going to start with you. My question, what are the challenges that Nigeria and countries like it face in ensuring successful post-crisis recovery? And going beyond that, what do you see as proven practices that help to overcome these challenges and that work in strengthening recovery systems at both the preparedness and the recovery stages?
Well, thank you very much. A number of challenges, actually. First of all, creating consensus. Consensus to be able to prioritize and to plan and to monitor together. We also are facing the challenge of coordination, coordinating the various actors that are in the field, trying to provide adequate response to the crisis that we have in the northeastern part of our country. Funding is also a challenge because the needs are high and the resources we have nationally are limited, and also even international resources that are applied to the problem is limited. So funding is an issue. And then the sustainability also is an issue, because you don't want to have stability today and then it's disrupted tomorrow. Permit me to say a little bit more about consensus, because this is very important to be able to achieve stable post-crisis recovery. We need to have consensus between major actors around peace, security, as well as promoting resilience in a fair and predictable conditions, regardless of whoever is the government is in power. To be able to leverage political consensus, we must have increased interaction between government and major economic agents, such as trade unions, but more specifically, the people that are affected by the crisis. And secondly, we must, as government, enact policies that would support stable recovery. And thirdly, we must be able to also have consensus around the development agenda, so that everybody is carried along in the planning, in the implementation, as well as in the monitoring and evaluation. Building resilience is important, because shocks to households, to communities, and to economics can wipe out very quickly hard-won gains and discourage risky but high-yielding innovations and even investments in the affected areas. Moderator, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, let me also say that we also need to recognize institutional and organizational settings for rebuilding the processes, as well as financial planning for the recovery itself. Equally important are the tools and the methodologies that we use to strengthen national governments and to facilitate international community engagement in the intervention processes. In Nigeria, what we've been doing is we're promoting resilience through post-crisis recovery by government's effort to rebuild the Northeast. And this is an area that has been in deep crisis for a couple of years now. We're doing this by engaging the communities at the local level, as well as at the regional level and at the state level. And in doing this, we have been able to develop a plan that we call the Buhari Plan. The Buhari Plan is Nigeria's developed comprehensive plan for restoration and rebuilding of peace in the Northeast. It is a plan that is already been implemented, and we are thankful to all of the various development and partners and humanitarian partners that are working with us to ensure the success of this plan.
Thank you. I think you mentioned a couple of very important, well, you've mentioned a lot there, but I think I'd note in particular, you've talked about institutional and financial systems which are important, but you also mentioned the challenge of funding. And I think it's a twofold challenge in a way, is we do need different instruments, more flexible instruments, but there's a fact of life. The resources are never sufficient. It is very rare that international commitments at a donor conference are followed through in their entirety. So there's always a gap. And the issue, therefore, is for countries and for communities. They're going to have to fill that gap themselves. How can they do it? And I think how can their international partners not implement, but help them help themselves in the future? And I think that other element you mentioned of creating consensus, you mentioned the importance of stabilization, peace, security as elements in the resilience dimension. But again, I think that important of, I think we start to see a sea change in the international development and crisis response world, where the last 50 years of perhaps often external partners diving in and perhaps almost taking too much control, it is gradually being replaced. And we're seeing our role as external partners as what it should be, accompaniment, to enable national actors and local actors to really have the dignity of choice about how they deal with their lives and their futures. So thank you for raising that. So, Mr. Glasser, Robert Glasser, your question next. So, 2 years after the adoption of the Sendai framework, and particularly of Priority 4, which has been the focus of this conference, Build Back Better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. So how is the world doing amidst accelerating complexity and multiple and colliding risks? Do you see political consensus building, and do you see engagement of national governments and their national and international partners, community organizations, private sector? Do you see that collaboration evolving in implementing recovery that is going to reduce risk and build resilience? So that was only about 10 questions in one, so take your pick.
Yes. So we've just last week held a major meeting on disaster risk reduction, the global platform in Cancun, Mexico. And actually one of the observations I'd make about that meeting is that it's really clear there's been huge progress made in terms of this priority 4 in the Sendai framework, strengthening disaster preparedness for response, taking action in anticipation of events, and even in Build Back Better, but there's some challenges there. We see Hurricane Patricia in Mexico, where the Mexicans evacuated 1 million people. In Sri Lanka, a similar huge evacuation. We've seen in places like Bangladesh over just a period of decades with 2 very similar storm cyclones of similar intensities and tracks, one causing tens of thousands of deaths and others causing maybe hundreds of deaths. The newspaper headline is that hundreds of people die in cyclone in Bangladesh. The real headline is that tens of thousands of people didn't die. And that's because of fundamentally the work of the Bangladeshi government and people, but supported by donors, by the UN, by the World Bank, and many others with early warning. We've seen the amount of early warning increasing dramatically as a result of much better modeling and greater predictability of weather events. And we've even seen early warning systems for earthquakes in some countries, even though it's a matter of seconds that you have the warning, places like Mexico. I think the real challenge is that, as you said, we have these hazards that are increasing, climate change, which is accelerating the frequency and intensity of natural hazards, and we have that combined with massive economic growth and investment, where in the next decades, according to the OECD, we have the ridiculously large figure of $50 trillion or more of investment in infrastructure. And if that infrastructure is not risk-informed, then we will see continuing escalating costs of disasters. The actual loss of life in many places has come down from disasters, loss of life, but the economic costs are continuing to skyrocket, in many places exceeding GDP growth. So there's a huge opportunity to channel $50 trillion of investment in ways that will not be exposed to disasters. The challenge is the question about consensus and political consensus. And our view about that is the way you encourage people to do that is by creating awareness of the cost of disasters historically and how they're changing as a result of climate change. That leads to a dollar figure that can then be part of a conversation with the finance ministry about why the investment makes sense. With Build Back Better, that's a second way of, sadly, a second opportunity to develop consensus, because you've just had a major disaster. There's political energy, there's anger and political energy for things to change. So I think these are the two big opportunities. Sadly, one as a result of a disaster to embed changes in the system, and those changes should be legislation, actually even before the disaster, clearly understanding the hazards. We have products like turning words into action for Build Back Better, but the World Bank, our colleagues in UNDP, have other tools. And as the minister said, building consensus early, before the disaster, about how we're going to build back better and how we take those things forward.
Can I just follow up with a quick question? Do you see more advanced preparedness? We still face so many crises where, after the event, we're struggling to put in place the arrangements, the institutional arrangements, the financing mechanisms, and so on. Do you see that being replaced by more preparedness now? Because you sounded very optimistic when you opened, so let's build on that optimism.
There's never enough money. That's the obvious point, and particularly with some donors withdrawing from some areas of work, it's a big challenge. But there has been huge progress, and you see governments enacting legislation that requires funding to go to prevention. We've seen legislation enacted on building codes and land use planning, zoning. So I think there is progress. The challenge is, with limited budgets and amount of money, how much to devote to what? And there are huge, there's malaria, you could name cigarette smoking, any global challenge. Anyone involved in that issue can make the case, the business case, for significant increased investment. The challenge is, for a government and for anyone really in the UN system as well, is working out, okay, given the risks, the business case for each of these investments, which one should we make now, which do we delay and make later?
So progress, but then at the same time, the risk factors are multiplying, as are the crisis events, and trying to get a handle on that. So, Monsieur Gnasunu, from a multilateral perspective, what are the countries of the global south doing to support each other in promoting resilient recovery and risk-informed sustainable development? What are they doing together to strengthen legal, institutional, and financial arrangements that enable them to lead recovery nationally and locally?
Well, thank you. What are we trying to do? We have one of those SDGs, which is 17, which call on us to work together in partnership. And I think that's where the ACP plays his role, the better and the greater, because we serve as platform to our countries. We have among our constituency what we call big ocean states, which others call small island states. But we have also countries in the desert, or we have countries where unique in the world, where the desert and the sea meet, in like Namibia. We have all sorts of situations where we can identify all sorts of disasters. What we have been trying to do is not to duplicate the effort which have been done, which we are supporting through initiatives like this ones, but also trying to build capacity for our countries to ensure that they have the information, but also they can go and organize themselves to go quickly to call for help when it's necessary. We have adopted at our Committee of Council of Ministers level last year guidelines for our countries in terms of disaster recovery. This is not to add to what is existing, but it's to tell them or to guide them through the system. When you are facing a disaster, with the scheme which are known to us, where to go, whom to speak to, and to make it quicker to reach out to those who are there to help them. But we have also situations in our regions which we are also supporting directly. Last 2 weeks ago, we have heard in the Caribbean, the CRIFS SPC signed with CDB an agreement to try to develop integrated sovereign risk management. Those are best practices which are happening in our countries. What Caribbean have been doing, facing some challenges, but they have been somehow successful in risk management. We have the same happening now in Africa. We have ARC, the African Risk Capacity, with whom we are discussing, trying to see how we can help them. We all said it, when it's happened, it's always too late, because now you have to find the money, it's too much money to find compared to what you have put in terms of insurance and preparation. But we have all identified at the CDB, the Caribbean Development Bank is doing it with, in the Caribbean. The African Development Bank is trying also to work with ARC, the African Risk Capacity, to really build a system. They are in a situation now where they are saying, well, the kind of resources that the African Development Bank have is not necessary enough or appropriate to initiate the system. So we are in discussion with them, with the Commission, the European Commission as well, to see how part of the resources which are there to support ACP countries' development can also be channeled to support the setting up of the ARC and to make it happen and work also. This is kind of things we are trying to do, and we are, I would say, we are reassured when we see that our efforts are paying. Like in Cabo Verde, a few years ago or 2 years ago, we saw the volcano eruption. There's no death. There was disaster. I mean, there was a disaster. There was destruction of infrastructure, but there was no death because they were prepared and they are able to face the situation. So we are having this kind of thing. We have same thing in Solomon Island a few years ago. So we have a situation where we can be proud of because the effort you have done, the resources, we cannot do it ourselves. We make some of our development resources, which we negotiate with the EU, make it available through the World Bank to implement program on our behalf. Through the UNDP, we are working as well. So this is how we are trying to do. Identify the need, I would say, to somehow mutualize it, make it less expensive to tackle, and bring it, the various actors, to make sure that what the response we are providing is a harmonized response, and it corresponds to what we can do together, and also, let's say, to bridge the gap when it's necessary. That's what we're trying to do in Africa, for example, for the African Development Bank and ARC in the system. So that's how we're trying to work. We are listening to our constituency. I'm happy to have heard what the minister have said, how the countries are getting organized. This is the kind of testimony we received, or the request also for support we receive for our countries generally, and we're trying to see how we can identify a resource, call on some of our partners to support them. So we are working as a platform, but also a knowledge-sharing system to help them to tackle the issue.
Okay. You talked about a harmonized response, but you've got small and large states, you've got landlocked and small island states, you've got drought-prone and flood-prone. So do you find you're developing platforms of different groupings, or how does that work? How do you harmonize responses when there are such different risk factors?
Well, it's still that the due diligence is still the same. So what we're trying to bring to them is to how to prepare for the due diligence, to get yourself organized, and the response or the system will be the same either in the situation of drought or in earthquake or in what we can see in our island. So we have best practices in terms of planning, governance actually, which kind of governance you should put in place to respond to the situation when it happens. We have it, we share it. It happened to be demonstrated that the same system can work if it is well set. So we have it working some area, and we are able to share with the others. It's working.
Thank you, thank you. Suman, way down there. So Suman Kumar, you're representing young leaders on this panel. And I think it's important to note that Suman is not waiting till he's rich, powerful, older, more influential. He's leading now. And he's not waiting to be a leader in the future. So 2 questions, Suman. First, how are young people leveraging their engagement and networks to promote resilience and risk-informed development? That's one. And second, as you look at the panel, what are your expectations of older leaders, such as some of us on the panel now? Do you see amongst this generation of leaders the necessary level of political consensus and political commitment required to build resilience in our ever more complex world, which is going to be your future world for much longer than us.
Thank you for your questions. So for the answer to the first question, first off, I would like to share my experience after the earthquake. So right after when earthquake happened in my home country, Nepal, I, along with my family, we were forced to move out of our house. And we lived on the field for, because there were a series of aftershocks coming over and over again. And one of the main reasons what motivated me to work towards helping out people who are in need was seeing there was this elderly woman right beside me, and she was extremely terrified. And at that time, what I tried to do was I went around, I looked around, and I saw bamboo sticks and trash. So what I did was I took all the trash that I could find, and I tried to make shelter out of it. And after I made my first shelter, I saw the sense of security on the face of the elderly women, and that is the main thing that motivated me towards working on rebuilding shelters. So after that, I was approached by one of my American friends, who came up with the idea of rebuilding shelters, building temporary shelters for the victims. And first off, we worked together, and because I come from a background, I'm also a machinist and a welder. So, and he happens to have an experience with social enterprises in the US and in Nepal. So what happened was he came up with the idea of shelters, and we got together, we designed our first structure, and we got a bunch of money from donations from our friends. So first off, we were able to make over 100 shelters, and after that, we partnered with over 130 organizations, and through generous donations of these all organizations, we were able to build over 5,300 shelters, which housed over 26,000 victims. And the most important takeaway for me from this point was almost all of the people who were involved in this project of ours were all young peoples. So my personal recommendation to all the young leaders, my personal recommendation to all the older generation leader here, right here, is to please believe in us, and please include us in the discussions when it comes down to the future of us and future of this generation, because we are an active part of this generation. We are most educated, we are capable enough to come up with the solution. And my other recommendation, and these recommendations are from me when I was working back home in Nepal, and because right now I'm also working with a social enterprise that's working on rebuilding schools that were destroyed by the earthquake. So my first recommendation, actually second, my second recommendation is private and public partnership, because right now what's happening back home in my country, Nepal, is most of the there's a very big gap between private sectors and public sectors. So private sectors, they do have a lot of technology, they do have a lot of innovation, and they are pretty active in what they are doing to rebuild the housing needs in Nepal. Whereas in public sector, what they have is they have a lot of political leverage, but their institutional setup is not in a way that has been effective. So if there is a fair bit of partnership between private and public sector, then it is always efficient to be more effective at rebuilding. And my second recommendation is global partnership. So, the 134, over 130 organizations that I mentioned that we work closely with, most of these organizations were from overseas. Some of them were from the US, some of them were from the Europe. And what we were able to do was we were able to leverage the expertise from all these individual organizations and all these individuals, and we were able to create something that was more scalable. Global partnership is, for me, it's personally, I feel in order to be effective, it's very important. And my last recommendation is investing on civil society and private sector, because what's happening in my country right now is most of the organizations, like my organization, right now I'm trying to rebuild a public school, but we do not have any support from the government side. We do not have any support from the public sector. Most of the funding that I raised was all from my personal contacts and some innovation challenges. So I feel like if we are able to invest more on civil society, the active civil society and private sectors, which are actually doing the work, real on-ground work, then it would be a lot beneficial, and it would be much more efficient. And also talking about global partnership. So with my organization right now, my organization is called School Relief, and what we do is we are trying to rebuild schools that were destroyed by earthquake, as I mentioned. So right now I'm studying mechanical engineering and business at the University of Rochester, upstate New York, and I was able to convince my engineering department at my university, and when I talked to my professors at my university, they were pretty excited about this project, and so they were convinced, and they offered me to voluntarily help in my project, to give me technical assistance. And also I am, right until this, the 8 engineering students have committed to come to Nepal, and as I'm talking right now, some of my friends right now are actually in Nepal building this school. And these engineering students are from all around the world, and one of the things that struck me the most was these engineering students of mine, they are extremely smart people, but right now they were applying for summer internships, and the reason why they came to Nepal, obviously first they wanted to help, but they didn't have any internships to do. So what I did with this global partnership is I basically created a platform where all of us can meet and contribute to the better cause. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think you remind us that first responders are always neighbors, friends, family members, and often without much in terms of external resources. And then years later, when the international community moves on to another crisis, they're still there to look at the longer-term resilience responses. So very important to support them, as you said, to believe in young people. And I want to agree that in the Nepal experience, the initial response of neighbors, first responders, young people was absolutely tremendous. There are so many excellent young entrepreneurs in Nepal. They're outside the government and they don't have too much faith in government. So when you say there should be partnership, I think probably what you'd be looking for is not to come into a rather tightly controlled system, but a system which enables you to get out and with the resources you have, get on with your work. And I think what we're seeing in Nepal is it's going to depend on community organizations, young people, the private sector, to reach the most isolated communities where resources don't reach under the normal programs. I thought you were going to pose a challenge to this particular meeting, and you didn't. Do you want to try that? Do you remember what you told me before?
So, so what I would like to challenge the leaders here is because I know this is the third time that this conference is happening, and what I believe is if we are here again in this place next year, and if we are again talking about the same issues, then for me, I personally think that we have not made any progress. So when we are here next year, I would want us to reflect and see what changes that we have already made. So that's my challenge.
Okay. So the third conference in this series, have we progressed or are we talking about the same issues? And for the next conference, will we repeat or will we learn from this one? So probably what we'll learn is we need to involve more young people next time, looking at the innovations that young people bring. But I think that leads me naturally on to Barbara Pesce-Montero. And a question I have for you, Barbara, which is, in a sense, precisely related to this. There has been a tremendous amount of knowledge generated here in the last few days about resilience and risk-informed recovery. So, following up the question, how are we going to be able to access that information, benefit from it, build upon it, and make it broadly available so that we don't have to repeat ourselves in the next conference or in our work back in our countries?
Thank you. You realize that we have two conferences that are overlapping, and I actually want to congratulate us all for that, because we had a large part of the team that's sitting in the room that participated to the World Reconstruction Conference, and we are closing that conference within the European Days of Development, and I think that is very good. Because, and that's probably one of the issues that goes in the step of what you're saying. We started off, and some of us were in the opening, by saying that if we don't deal with resilience and we don't deal with recovery correctly, we really take several steps back in obtaining the goals. That in fact, it is necessary to deal with the humanitarian impact of disasters or of conflict, but that's not sufficient, because these recurrent disasters or these recurrent crises, which now more and more overlap. So you have natural disasters that occur in areas which are very vulnerable and have a much stronger impact, and you've been in Haiti, and you know this, Syria is this, let's look at Sudan. These are countries that have crisis environments, and then the drought comes or a war comes, and instead of being able to cope, they take several steps back. And if we are not able to prepare for them, if we're not able to intervene rapidly, but if we don't just intervene from a humanitarian perspective and at the same time deal with the other issues, then we'll not reach the goals. Or in many cases, if we had the goals, we go back. And in going back without doing what I'm going to talk about now, which is recovery, you end up leaving the most vulnerable behind. And so you have a country that comes afterwards, which is actually much worse than the one that you had before you had the disaster or the conflict. So first of all, let's congratulate ourselves. I think that is very good, and we're I think getting where we want to go, but we still have a long way ahead of us. We started off in the opening by discussing recovery, and this is what is new with Sendai. And the fourth priority is a very clearly saying it's no longer just humanitarian. We need to look at this nexus between the humanitarian and the development, but we also need to see it from a recovery perspective and not just from a reconstruction perspective. In the past, and that's why things evolve, in the past it was just, okay, we have a disaster, now we go back and build roads or big hospitals. Now we're saying if we have a disaster, what we need to do is make sure that the social economic texture is reestablished. Therefore, we need to look at assets, we need to look at livelihoods, we need to look at people, and then we also need to reconstruct the economy and make sure that this is sustainable over time. So we're really talking about the goals in a very vulnerable kind of situation. I was talking to somebody yesterday, actually, and he, because I was also in a panel on SMEs, and he was telling me that if you're not able to reactivate the SMEs within 30 days of the disaster, you're actually killing them, because it's very difficult for them to then get the support, the funding to go on. So it is about, all of this all comes together just like the SDGs do. If you don't understand recovery and you don't implement it from the beginning, and you don't just do early recovery, which we've been used to talking about, you have to start with early recovery right from the disaster, but you really need to look at the longer term recovery and you need to invest in it. And the reason why it's also good to discuss it here today, and this is my personal experience because I've worked in many of these countries, is that this often falls between the cracks. This is not humanitarian, and it's, so, you know, the humanitarian environment will say it's about life-saving. It's not strictly life-saving, although it, you know, it sort of is, but it's not life-saving, so it doesn't fall in the strict humanitarian. And it's not the long-term development, which takes a while and therefore, often there isn't the funding for it. And I've had lots of cases of governments who come and say, you know, you all flood in at the disaster, and then the news go, and after 10 days, we're left with, you know, with a disaster in our hands, with people who are living in very vulnerable situations. So what has this conference done? It's put recovery very clearly now on the agenda, and it has generated all the expertise and all the discussions into something that I think should and will continue in these next year, as an immediate roadmap. It is in this partnership where, and I was with these terrible lights, I think we're the resilient part of a lot of the people who are here are the ones who participated in the conference. It's people who come from the countries, who come from the national governments, and those that we work with, but also all the partners and to discuss recovery in this way, in the spirit of partnership, and making sure we all understand it in the same way, and that we're sure that in the disasters, and I was asked a similar question at the opening, I said, what would you like to see? I want to make sure that in the next El Niño, which we already know is going to come now, or what is happening in Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, that we actually apply what we're saying on the recovery, and that it's not just a fad. And I think with what has been discussed, this is the case. And this partnership that we have with the World Bank and the UN and the ACP on these PDNAs, which are the assessments, we need to make sure, as of now, that these assessments really seriously take recovery into account, and that we are able not just to assess them, but to make sure that the funding also goes there. And I think part of the discussion that we've had these days is how to ensure predictable funding and flexible funding, because very often the funding tends to be either humanitarian or longer-term development, which is not necessarily very flexible. So can we create funds? Can we create mechanisms that once we do these assessments are actually able to go in? I think that is the real discussion that the countries are looking at us to respond to. So these conferences for me make sense if they're about implementation, sharing information, but then looking at how we can move forward. Many things have been looked at. There are platforms that are being developed, toolkits that are being developed. There is information that is online. So I think the instruments are there. We need to develop them further because recovery is such a complex area. It's multi-sectoral. It involves many more actors. So the realization of this, the political commitment to it, of all of our organization, we represent a big chunk of the actors that are on the ground on this. The clear request from the governments that we take this into account and that we support in the challenges. These are good steps forward, and what I see positively is that we continue moving forward, that this is a process which is ongoing. The dimensions are big. The resilience communication that the Commissioner referred to, I think, goes along those lines. The resilience communication is very closely linked to the SDGs, so we are moving forward, and I think this conference, in this sense, was very successful, as you'll hear from the statement that we will share soon.
Thank you. So that was very positive. So, Suman, I think you've got a job, which is at the next conference you're going to have to be the conscience of resilience to see whether we've progressed, whether we've moved beyond prescription, and the next meeting is really going to be experience-based. How have we moved ahead? How can we apply those experiences elsewhere? So you've got yourself at least one job there. But I hope the other one is that you are enabled at home in Nepal to work as you have been doing, with maximum support and minimum interference. So, Same Wahba. I think it's one thing to see consensus building on how to put risk management and recovery financing in place before crises break, but how do we meet the daunting financial requirements for an ever-growing number of large-scale recovery programs, and especially in a rapidly urbanizing world?
Okay. Thanks, Nigel. I think we've heard a lot of really important things in this conference, and I really wanted now to give a perspective on the financing challenge, taking into account the confluence of the three major variables that you're dealing with, which is urbanization, conflict, and disasters, and the way they intersect together to create a much more daunting challenge than we've ever experienced. Now, in terms of urbanization, we're talking about a very fast pace of urbanization and 2.5 billion people who will be flocking into cities in the coming 25 years, with major needs in terms of urban infrastructure, service delivery, and so on and so forth. When we look at conflict and we look at the statistics over the past 5 years, let's say from 2008 onwards till 2013, we found that about 27.5 million persons are displaced every year on average, 60% of which go into cities. And then in terms of disasters, a recent World Bank and GFDRR study has estimated that the global annual losses, consumption losses due to disasters, amount to $500 billion every year, with a potential of pushing up to 26 million persons more into poverty every year. I mean, this is the type of challenge that we're dealing with. Now, if you look at the size of the existing urban infrastructure gap globally, I'm not talking here only about recovery, but I'm talking about the deficit in stock and infrastructure. We're talking about an estimate of about 4.5 to 5.4 trillion US dollars per year for resilient infrastructure, with a premium of resilience of about 9 to 27%, so somewhere between $500 billion to $1 trillion. Now, you compare this amount to official development assistance, which is less than 200 billion per year. This is totally a drop in the bucket. So the normal way of doing things, relying on development assistance, etc., is not going to be what will help us finance this infrastructure, let alone, the cost of recovery that is needed. So we have to do things in a very, very different way. So in terms of financing mechanisms, in addition to the mechanisms that exist for risk finance, things like contingent lines of credit, insurance products, elements of flexibility that allow to reallocate funding across portfolios to deploy towards recovery, development policy lending that supports strengthening of resilience. So we've got a suite of instruments for risk finance that can help us promote and finance basically resilient recovery, but that, as I mentioned, is far from being enough. So the different way in which we can do things involve, one, domestic resource mobilization. We have to work with national governments and local government to increase the mobilization of local revenues. So at the World Bank, we worked with Kampala Capital City Authority on strengthening their revenue generation, and year on year they have increased their revenues by about 86% on average. Now that's 86% more that they can invest in recovery into resilient infrastructure. we have to also work in supporting local governments, which are the first line of governments that are dealing with issues of resilient recovery and infrastructure and service delivery. We have to help them strengthen their creditworthiness, improve their financial management, improve revenues, rationalize expenditures, better manage their assets so that they can head towards a trajectory of creditworthiness and being able to tap domestic capital markets. More importantly, we've got what is known as land value capture, which is basically as a result of any investment that you make that ends up valorizing land, there is an ability to recoup part of this appreciation in land value due to an infrastructure, planning, government investment decision towards financing either ex ante or ex post the cost of this improvement. So to the extent that there are investments that can help improve the resilience of cities or of areas that are vulnerable to risk, that can build back better, reduce risk, build those flood embankments that are going to provide the type of flood protection that is needed, these enhance land values, and part of that gain can be recycled back towards financing the cost of this infrastructure. And that gives us much more of a leeway in terms of being able to finance this infrastructure. Suman has mentioned it's very important to have public-private partnerships. I mean, the government cannot do it alone. We need the private sector in there. And to get the private sector in there, there are instruments like guarantees, like other types of credit enhancement that can be put into place that could bring the private sector to step in. We've heard from the EU Director Ridolfi about the de-risking facilities. These are all needed to bring the private sector in place. Now, this is what concerns the financing challenge. But we have to remember that before we deal with the financing challenge, we have to deal with the planning challenge. Because mobilizing the financing alone without having appropriate plans is not going to work. It might end up entailing having dysfunctional investments or investment, subsidizing solutions that are not the most effective or efficient to address the challenge. So we need plans, and in order to have the plans, we need also policies, and most importantly, we need institutions in place. Thanks.
Thank you. Can I come back on your last statement? We face a planning challenge. We need better planning. But it's a fact that there is massive in-migration to cities which is unplanned. And people go and live in unplanned poor communities. And one of the earlier sessions, somebody said, poor people have to forego decent housing just to get access to an indecent livelihood. So how do you start to tackle it? We're faced with a totally unplanned situation, massive in-migration. How does one start to turn that around?
So I think I was the one who said that in the previous panel. I think what really matters is the way land markets are functioning. The amount of dysfunctions in terms of land markets, in terms of the inefficient land use planning that exists into place, the lack of integration of land use planning and infrastructure, the fact that a large swaths of land in the middle of cities are underdeveloped or undeveloped, maybe under state or local government ownership, but not being leveraged or utilized, create dysfunctional land markets that shut off the poor out of the market. To the extent that land availability, land use planning, development densities, you go into places like Mumbai and Sao Paulo, cities that many of you might know, and discover that the floor area ratio, which is the amount of development that you can put on the land, is a multiple of 1.5 or maybe 2, which means you can build maybe half of the land 4 floors. I mean, in cities like that, that's lack of density and inability to create agglomeration, and that type of challenges that face our land markets. The ones who pay the cost of that are the poor, because their ability to access land or access affordable housing in these conditions is practically inexistent. They either have to go and live 2-3 hours away from the city on marginal land, peripheral land, that's very far off, that's not connected with transport infrastructure, in order to access formal housing, or if they want to live closer to job opportunities, the only lands that are available tend to be floodplains, areas on mountain slopes that are prone to landslides, and therefore they would be trading basically their livability, decent formal housing and land, with an access to an economic opportunity that comes at the cost of putting their lives at risk. So for us to be able to do something about this, the first thing that we need to do is fix land markets.
Thank you. And that issue will grow and grow and grow as more and more people come to live in cities. So thank you. So, Wade Warren, I left you the easiest job in that you spoke right at the beginning. So your opportunity to intervene again. And so having listened to your fellow panelists, what strikes you as particularly essential to successfully leverage political consensus and engagement to ensure resilient post-crisis recovery and sustainable risk-informed development? The floor is yours.
So Nigel warned me before the panel began that he wanted me to kind of sum up and mention anything that had gotten left out during the panel conversation, and I'm not sure, frankly, that I'm equal to that task. It's been, I think, a very rich discussion, and so many good points have been raised. But I thought I would just highlight a couple of things that stood out for me as important points. And the first one is, I mentioned this in my opening remarks, that this is not easy. Building resilience is not easy. It touches all sectors. It cuts across all ministries. And I think governments and donors are both struggling and find it challenging to know what to do. But as I listen to the panel and I think about what's really important, one thing that stands out for me is the importance of governance, and in particular local governance, community governance in building resilience. And I think you could say that many of the crises that we see today could be characterized as a failure of governance. And I don't think that I, as a representative of a donor organization, can presume to really build a sustainable and resilient mechanisms in a country without relying on the local communities. And I think of, just as an example, if you think about rebuilding housing after a disaster, you have local zoning and building requirements, you have cultural considerations, you have climate considerations, you have considerations around maintenance of new structures over time, you have legal issues, whether people have land title, property rights or not, you have different considerations for families and for tenants versus owners. So the challenges are so great, and only, I think, a local community can help navigate those difficulties. So I would say one key lesson for me, or one key thing to highlight, is the importance of governance and local governance in particular. And then the second thing that I think is worth repeating, and I heard it several times, and I certainly feel it as a representative of a donor agency, is we are in a resource-constrained world, and I feel that in particular in my country now, where our budgets are limited. And I don't think we can emphasize enough the fact that donors increasingly need to become facilitators and catalysts of funding. And so to me, that includes working with the private sector, as a number of us have mentioned already. It means that donors have to work together and collaborate and coordinate in a smarter way than we ever have before. And we have to find ways to mobilize domestic resources, as we've seen in Kenya and Ethiopia. So I would highlight that point. And then I can't conclude without responding to Sumam. I loved hearing from you, and I have a lot of respect for what you've done in Nepal. And I very much take to heart your challenge to us to not be in the same place next year that we are this year. And I think that we won't be, but I don't think we will have a revolutionary change by a year from now. These are hard things to do. I think we're learning lessons around the world. I think we're seeing progress. There are things that we can build on, and we will build on them, and we'll keep trying to do better. So my challenge to you, I guess, is to have some faith in us, and we'll work with you, and you work with us, and we'll be in a better place next year than we were this year.
Thank you. So no revolutionary change in 12 months, maybe 18. Huh? Thank you for your focus on resource constraints, but also on governance. It reminds me when I worked in Haiti with the the Department of Peacekeeping, one of the main indicators that they used for democracy was holding elections. And yet we work with an anthropologist who went around the country for a year asking ordinary Haitians what they believed democracy was. And a consensus came out on 3 things: sleeping on a mattress instead of on the floor, getting 2 meals a day instead of 1, and living in a community where those with a little more help those with a little less. And I think that points to an issue about what are we talking about when we're talking about governance and resilience. I think one of the critical factors to measure whether there is democracy is whether a government can help deliver basic social services, social protection to the people who need it. So I think the resilience debate helps us refocus what we think about governance. Good, we're getting to the end of our session, and that's the end of the panel discussion. We're going to move on to look at the main outcomes of the meeting. But before we do that, would you join me, please, in thanking our panel and giving them a round of applause for that? Thank you very much. Okay, Barbara, I'm going to hand back over to you to share with us, not the entire communique, but maybe some of the highlights of the conference communique, which are going to point to all our many amazing achievements in this conference. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. And if you don't mind, I'll do it from here. So it was very intense. There were 29 sessions, which were organized around 4 main themes, being recovery, the main sort of underlying thematic, following Sendai and following the summit, but also the humanitarian summit. And it was around these 4 topics: recovery interventions, recovering conflict and fragile situation, recovery preparedness, and leveraging political consensus on this priority 4. There were also 2 special sessions, one on Nepal and another on Somalia. The key messages to take away is that resilient recovery is an imperative for sustainable development. And I think, because we're going to give you sort of the main, that situations of conflict and fragility require special attention in recovery processes. The examples that were identified reiterated the need of this, and also that conflict sensitivity must be built in all recovery activities to avoid unintended negative consequences of an open or latent conflict. A third point was, as we've heard in the panel and also here, preparing for recovery pays off. Not just preparing for disaster, but also preparing for recovery, understanding that there's a need to look at livelihoods, assets and reconstruction, and being prepared, having the actors, having the information available, and having created the capacity in the countries. A fourth one is that better prepared communities recover faster. And so the leverage on the governance issues that was just being mentioned, not only at the local governments, but also at the community level. There is a lot that can be done. Local ownership and leadership is absolutely essential. Fifth, women's participation as actors in recovery is essential for building back better. I think once we understand that it's no longer just about building big roads and big schools, but it's about getting the social economic texture moving forward too, women have a fundamental role, and therefore this was recognized. I think there were sessions where different agencies who deal with this were also involved, and good practices were demonstrated. On 6 points, cultural heritage is a central element in resilient recovery and reconstruction, but you really need to base your answer on the specifics of the environment in which you're working, and this needs to be embedded in the preparation. And finally, that the potential for partnership with the private sector should especially be pursued, and that we should really be looking at the risk financing. So in many ways, the issues that this panel has also raised. And therefore, I think a lot of good base for work in which all the actors were involved. We have our plate full in terms of very important work that should be done in the spirit of partnership. Thank you.
Thank you. So in the next conference, we'll be looking at this and saying, well, this was what was said last time, where action must be taken. But in the next conference, we're actually going to describe the action that has been taken and how it's going to scale. So if we can do that, then we will have achieved progress and not wasted our time. So we're getting to the last action. So now to conclude the conference on behalf of the organizers and on behalf of us all, it's my pleasure to ask Sami Wahwa to make his concluding remarks.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of our time here together in Brussels, sadly. So you will have seen the video and you've seen, what a week we've had together. It's been a genuine pleasure being part of the many discussions that have taken place over these past few days. And I wanted to thank each and every one of you for the energy and enthusiasm that you've brought into this agenda. Between the coffee breaks, the fascinating people we've met, sometimes we can also forget the reasons that brought us all over here. And that is the fact that over the past 20 years, more than 1.3 million people lost their lives in a natural disaster. And more than 200 million people have been severely affected, losing livelihoods, assets, belongings, and a sense of home. What's more, the economic toll of these events is simply staggering, talking about consumption losses just from extreme weather events of about $500 billion every year. Now, what does this figure represent? It represents educational opportunities that were never achieved, healthcare services that were never provided, and SMEs that have been forced to ruin. And it is also causing about 26 million people every year to be pushed into poverty. Now, when you come and visit us at the World Bank in our headquarters in Washington, we have our mission statement written right over the entrance. And it's a dream. Our dream is a world without poverty. So you can imagine we take these statistics very seriously. Now, disasters are not inevitable, but they're certainly not going anywhere anytime soon. We all know the events that made the headlines over the last few decades, be it the Indian Ocean tsunami, Hurricane Katrina, the Great Eastern Japan earthquake, or Typhoon Haiyan. But the sobering fact is that these disasters likely make up less than 10% of the smaller, more frequent events that do escape the spotlights, that bring devastation to millions. But we also know that when catastrophe strikes, there is a critical opportunity to build back better, to strengthen communities and reduce future disaster risks. So how then can we ensure that developing countries adequately prepare for recovery scenarios? How can we support governments so that they are able to respond efficiently and effectively when a crisis strikes? How do we help countries do recovery right? This is finally why we're here all together in the World Reconstruction Forum Conference. In each of the different circles we come from, be it government or NGOs, civil society, academia, or the private sector, we know that recovery needs to be done differently. And I hope that at the end of our 3 days together, you come away energized with new ideas about how to make this happen. Now, I want to extend many, many thanks to the organizers of this event who have made this all possible. There was tireless effort on behalf of the ACP Group of States, the European Union, UNDP, and my own colleagues at the World Bank and GFDRR. So please do join me in giving them a round of applause to everyone who has made this week a success. Most importantly, I want to thank you all for being here, for the engaged participation, and for helping us push forward the resilient recovery agenda on the local, national, and global stage. I look forward to working with you to put these lessons learned here into practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samit. That's it. That brings to the end our WRC number 3. Thank you again for coming. I hope we will return energized, and we will be doing a few things on the ground before the next conference, but see you next time. The conference is adjourned. Thank you.